So, meine Damen und Herren, die Keynote steht an. Und es ist wirklich, we are so happy to have you here. Der jetzt zu Ihnen sprechen wird, ist einer der ausgewiesenen Insektenökologen Europas, wenn nicht sogar weltweit. Er hat sagenhafte 290, ca. 300 wissenschaftliche Veröffentlichungen schon publiziert und seine Bücher haben Hunderttausende fasziniert. Die sind in 17 Sprachen übersetzt, hat er mir gerade gesagt. Einer seiner Erfolgstitel heißt »Und sie fliegt doch«, eine kurze Geschichte der Hummel, dann »Das Summen der Wiese«, ein weiterer Titel, und dann »Die seltensten Bienen der Welt«. Und in diesem Jahr hat er das Buch Wildlife Gardening auf den Markt gebracht. In Deutsch ist es erschienen als Garden Jungle. Also ist auch in Deutschland beim Hansa Verlag zu kaufen. Er schreibt nicht nur, sondern er handelt. Er hat einen Bumblebee Conservation Trust gegründet. Das sind 12.000 Mitglieder, die sich um den Schutz der Hummel kümmern. Das ist sagenhaft. Und er ist nebenbei noch Professor für Bumblebees an der Universität von Sussex. Wurde vom BBC Wildlife Magazine unter die 50 einflussreichsten Menschen im Naturschutz gewählt. Also, den wollen Sie jetzt kennenlernen, gell? We are so glad to have you here, to have your knowledge about bumblebees, wild bees, insects in every respect. Professor Dave Goulson. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I didn't understand a word of it, but I hope it was lovely. Thank you, my fellow Europeans, for the moment, for allowing me to visit. I'm going to talk to you about insect declines, but to start off with, I wanted to start with something bigger. This is a little bit cliched, but this is our home. This is where we live. It's been home to every human that's ever lived and to maybe 10 million or so other species of animal and plant. It's where we get our food and our water and our air, and it's our source of inspiration and natural beauty, and we're destroying it. It's absolutely ridiculous. I don't understand why we're being so stupid. We're all aware of the huge issues that we're creating for our planet, but we don't seem to be doing terribly much to address them. So you could probably add to this list if you tried, but life on Earth faces many threats, including our own life. Climate change alone, according to some predictions, might wipe out maybe half of the species on the planet by the end of this century. But it isn't just climate change on its own, because we're still chopping down the rainforests. We're polluting the seas, the rivers, the soil, the air with fertilizers and pesticides and a whole bunch of other chemicals and plastics. We're depleting the oceans of fish. We're eroding the soils. And I could go on and on. It's quite depressing. But we need to do better, obviously, if we want future generations to have the same kind of standard of living that we've had. So today the focus is really on one particular aspect of what's happening to our planet, the impact of what we're doing on biodiversity, and particularly, of course, insects, which make up the bulk of biodiversity. Maybe 60% of known species are different types of insect. And we've known for quite some time that insects are declining. We don't have data for the majority of insect species. In fact, we haven't even named the majority of insect species yet. We've perhaps named 20% of the insects that exist on the planet. And of the ones that we know exist, we're only actually monitoring the populations of a tiny proportion of those insects. But for example, we have good data from some countries for butterfly populations. These are UK butterflies, the sort of more common ones at the top and the rarer ones at the bottom. But you can see that over time, broadly, they're becoming less common, as are moths, which we also monitor in the UK in reasonable detail. So we've known this for quite some time, but nonetheless, the results from Germany, the Krefeld study, which is probably why everyone is really here today, came as a bit of a shock because the scale, the magnitude of insect declines that study revealed seemed to be greater than anything that had previously been suspected. And this isn't just one group of insects, the butterflies or the moths. This is all flying insects, which is most insects. And as I'm sure you're aware, this study used malaise traps to catch flying insects. And what I'm showing you here is the biomass, the daily weight of insects caught per trap from 1989 to 2014. And it dropped by about 75% in 26 years, which is really terrifying. And it got lots of media interest. It got people around the world talking about loss of the insects and speculating as to whether this is happening everywhere, or is this just something peculiar to Germany? I can't think what it would be that's peculiar to Germany. Certainly the rest of Western Europe is managed in a very similar way. The landscape looks very similar. But we don't have data from Spain or the United Kingdom or whatever that's comparable. But nonetheless, this should be deeply concerning to all of us. Just in one slightly less well-known study that appeared after the Krefeld study should also be a cause of serious alarm. This is a study that came from Puerto Rico, and it's of the insects living in rainforests there. An American scientist had sampled these rainforests in great detail in the 1970s, 76 and 77, using sweep nets and also sticky traps to catch insects. And he revisited the same places in 2012, 2011, 2012, 2013, and exactly repeated what he'd done in the 1970s, and found that his sweep nets caught approximately 25% of the biomass that they'd caught 30 years earlier. And the sticky traps, which aren't shown here, the biomass of insects caught on sticky traps had fallen in some cases by 98%. In a rainforest which is still intact, it hasn't been cut down. And it hasn't been sprayed with pesticides so far as we know. So this certainly suggests that these patterns of decline are more widespread than just Germany or the United Kingdom. So does it matter if insects disappear? Well, of course it does. You wouldn't be here if you didn't think this was important. And perhaps one of the best quotes, the most often used quotes on this subject, is from E.O. Wilson, American scientist. I'll just read you the last bit. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And of course it's true. Insects make up the bulk of life on Earth. But they also do all sorts of important stuff, without which the rest of life on Earth couldn't survive, including us. So they're food for a very large number of birds, bats, lizards, amphibians like frogs, freshwater fish, and then they do a whole bunch of other things, which I won't go through because I haven't got time. But if we were to remove the insects from the ecosystem, which seems to be what's happening, then essentially ecosystems would collapse into chaos, as E.O. Wilson said. Now this is just one of the best known things that insects do is pollination, and I just thought, having spoken for 5 minutes and thoroughly depressed you, I'd show you some pretty pictures of some nice insects, just to admire really. You all know about pollination, but it's one of the things that insects do that we depend upon, because roughly a third of the food we eat requires some kind of insect to visit one of our crops for it to produce fruit or vegetables. So why are insects declining? There are a whole bunch of reasons. I haven't got time to go into them in any depth at all. I'm not going to say any more about disease or climate change, despite the fact that both of them in their different ways are important. I'll say a little bit more about the other two. So firstly, loss of habitat. From an insect's point of view, we have got rid of most of their favorite habitats in Europe and increasingly around the world. And one of the richest habitats for insect life in Europe historically were our hay meadows, these flower-rich grasslands, which we used to have large areas of in Western Europe. Britain alone, a small island, had about 3 million hectares of flower-rich grasslands 100 years ago. But in Britain, we've lost 98% of this habitat and replaced it with things like this. And it's pretty obvious from an insect's perspective why that's not good news. And increasingly, we've turned the landscape into vast monocultures of crops. So this is a little bit childish, but I'm just going to take you on a Google Street View tour of Europe. So 5 different countries. See if you can work out which one is Germany. This starts with the United Kingdom, and then a series of bleak, monotonous landscapes. Not all of Europe looks like this, of course. One of those was Germany. I can't remember which. My point is that we've scraped away whatever naturally existed in these places. There would have been thousands of species living in these landscapes historically, and we've tried to replace them with just one species, the crop, and we've done a pretty good job of that to date. That's the United States. Looks much the same. Of course, we need to feed people. There are 7 billion of us, and there will soon be 10, 11, perhaps 12 billion people. And we need to provide food. The route of feeding them, though, that we've gone down is one which has basically made much of the surface of the planet hostile to any other form of life. And I would question whether this is the right way to feed people, which is something I'll come back to if I've got time. So then the final cause of insect declines that I'm going to talk about is the most controversial one, and it's intimately interlinked with what I was just talking about. You can't grow these vast monocultures of crops without using lots of pesticides. Sorry for putting up a very busy, crowded slide, but I'm doing this for a reason. This is something we've been studying in my research group at Sussex University, the impact of agrochemicals on bumblebees. And we worked with our local farmers, and we asked the local farmers to give us lists of the pesticides they applied to each field. And this is one field, one crop, an oilseed rape crop that was sown in August of 2012 and harvested in June of 2013. And this is just a list of the chemicals the farmer applied to one field. There's a couple of fertilizers, and there's 20 different pesticides going onto that crop. A mix of different insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, molluscicides. Small wonder, really, that there isn't much insect life living in farmland when it's being bombarded with quite so many chemicals. If you were growing fruit or vegetables in your garden to feed to yourself or to feed to your kids, would you be comfortable putting 20 different pesticides on and then serving it up for lunch? I don't think you would, but this is normal farming practice. He's not a bad farmer, he's just following the advice of his agronomist. I don't have overall headline figures for pesticide use in Germany, but I do for the UK. And every year, UK farmers apply 16.9 thousand tons of pesticides to one small island. I would imagine the figure would be larger for Germany, as it's a bigger country. 16.9 thousand tons of poison going onto the landscape. And then we wonder why the insects are disappearing. But it isn't just that; those figures are just for farmed use. We can also buy a whole range of pesticides to use in our gardens and in our own homes. And they're readily available from garden centers, from DIY stores, from the local supermarket will sell you a whole range of pesticides these days. Some of these are really nasty chemicals, and for them to be sold to people with no training at all, people who probably won't bother to read the back of the bottle and follow the instructions, probably will apply some extra for luck, won't bother to wear protective gloves or anything else. This seems absolutely nuts, and personally, I think we should completely ban pesticides for use in our cities. You might think that sounds extreme, but France did this. They've done it already. If France can do it in all of their cities, why can't we do it in every city in Europe, in the world? Even if you don't use pesticides yourself in your garden, perhaps you've got a wildlife-friendly garden and you deliberately plant plants to encourage pollinators. Unfortunately, you might still be bringing pesticides into your garden. Many plants in garden centers in the UK, I don't know if this is common in Germany, they're badged as being good for pollinators. They're being marketed to people who want to look after wildlife. That's the Royal Horticultural Society's logo, which they allow garden centers to put on plants which provide nectar and pollen that's attractive to bees and butterflies and so on. So we bought a whole selection of these plants, bee-friendly plants from garden centers in the UK, and we screened them for pesticides. Nearly every one contained pesticides. 70% of bee-friendly plants on sale in garden centres contained neonicotinoid insecticides, which are notoriously particularly toxic to insects. So they're not exactly bee-friendly, it seems to me. I think this is an absolute scandal that people are selling bee-friendly plants full of insecticides, but this, I suspect, is exactly the same in Germany as it is in the UK. These plants are mass-reared in huge greenhouses, often in the Netherlands. Even if you've managed to avoid all of those problems and not introduce pesticides to your garden via plants you've bought or pesticides you've sprayed, you might inadvertently be introducing them via your dog or cat. And this is something very few people know. It's a bit depressing, but this is the commonest European, best-selling flea treatment in Europe, which you drip onto the back of the neck of your dog or cat prophylactically once a month. And you can't read it, but just there, it says there is the active ingredient. It's imidacloprid. It's one of those neonicotinoid insecticides. It's one of the ones that's been banned for use by farmers, but you can still buy it and drip it onto your dog. Seems slightly nuts to me. The dose that you put on a dog every month, if you follow your vet's advice, is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. And this is water soluble, so if your dog jumps into a stream, it's going to all wash off immediately. And that's a huge dose of insecticide going into that stream, pond, lake, whatever. Okay. So through all these different uses, we've managed to pollute the global environment with a whole bunch of nasty chemicals. And that's really nicely illustrated by this study from Switzerland 2 years ago, where these Swiss scientists collected honey samples from around the world, and they screened them just for neonicotinoid insecticides. They didn't look for other pesticides. But 75% of the samples from around the world contained neonicotinoids. So 3/4 of all of the world's honeybees have highly toxic insecticides in their food. And again, we wonder why insects globally seem to be declining. Well, if we've essentially contaminated the entire global environment with insecticides, it's really not that surprising. So, our poor insects are being bombarded from all sides by a whole range of stressors. They can't find good habitat with lots of flowers if they're pollinators. I haven't talked about it, but they're often infected with foreign diseases that we've accidentally brought in. And when they do find flowers to drink nectar from, there's a good chance they'll be contaminated with a whole complicated cocktail of chemicals that we've added to the environment. And they might be able to cope with one or two of these things on their own, but in combination, it's little wonder that our insects are disappearing. Imagine if you're hungry and infected with disease, and then when you do find some food, it's full of poison. We shouldn't be surprised if you died. And it's the same with bees or hoverflies or whatever. Sorry, I'm just not being rude. I'm not going to take a call. I'm just checking the time. So, what can we do? Well, the good news is there's lots we can do. Because these things live all around us, it's a much more accessible conservation problem than many of the big global issues like cutting down of rainforests, polar bears, not having any ice to live on anymore, things you feel helpless about. But with bees, we can all get involved in looking after them. I ought to speed up a bit because we're running late, so I won't say so much. But I would love it if we could turn our cities into giant bee nature reserves. And I think we could, giant insect reserves. See our cities as a network of habitat stretching throughout the landscape, providing a home for wildlife. And it's really easy to do. We just need to mow a little less, be less neat and tidy with our lawns. This is my lawn. If you stop mowing it, within a couple of weeks, it springs into flowering life, and swarms of bees and butterflies come to visit the flowers. I haven't sown any flowers at all. It's just the lawn that I inherited when I bought the house. We need to encourage people to grow the right kinds of flowers. Ones like this, these are both roses, but unfortunately, plant breeders over hundreds of years have developed new varieties of plants, selecting for things that the breeders thought humans would like, extra petals, bigger blooms, and so on. But they've often inadvertently made the flowers useless, unattractive to insects. So this here, you might think that's a beautiful rose, but it's a mutant in which the anthers that produce the petals are, instead of being anthers, they're expressed as extra sets of petals. So it's just a bundle of petals. As far as a bee is concerned, this is an abomination that we should get rid of. So if we could just encourage people to grow flowers like this instead, and similarly to get rid of these hideous things that you might think that's a bit extreme, but if you go to a garden centre in spring, this time of year, certainly in the UK, there are trays and trays of these kind of plants outside, annual bedding plants. They're in disposable plastic trays. You drive to buy them. They've been grown in peat-based compost. They've been drenched in pesticides. There is nothing green about these things at all. And aside from all of that, insects don't like them anyway. So get rid of those hideous things and grow some nice traditional cottage garden flowers. There's loads of advice out there about which ones are good for bees, including in my new book, by the way. Aside from our gardens, there's lots of green space in cities that could be made more wildlife friendly by, for example, sowing wildflowers on road verges. This used to be a neat mown grass verge, as you can see on the other side of the road still. Now it's a mass of wildflowers. Wouldn't it be great if every road verge was like that, if every roundabout was like this? So we could turn our cities into giant nature reserves, and I think that would be brilliant. But the majority of the landscape is farmland. And I just want to finish by saying a few words about how we might make farming more insect-friendly. And I have some fairly radical, extreme views on this, as you might have guessed. So, well, one option, one alternative way of feeding the world would be to go organic. We could just stop using pesticides. The counter-argument to that is that yields are slightly lower from organic farming compared to conventional with the pesticides. Globally, they're not that much lower. Different estimates put it at between 82% and 90% of the yield of conventional farming. So it's not a huge amount less food that we could grow without any pesticides, but it is less. But when you consider that we waste a third of the food that we grow in the world, actually, if we could significantly reduce food waste, we could go organic tomorrow globally and still be able to feed everyone. Also, of course, you know these things. We eat way too much meat, and it's a really inefficient way of feeding people. And sadly, global per capita, per person meat consumption is increasing at the moment, as well as the human population increasing, which is exactly the opposite of what we really want to be aiming for. And particularly, of course, red meat, particularly corn-fed beef, is about the worst, most inefficient way you could possibly dream up of feeding people. And yet we're doing more and more of it. Also, sorry, we eat too much. We've got a global epidemic of obesity. So if we could persuade people to eat more healthily, to eat less red meat, and to waste less food, we could do an awful lot less of all that industrial farming. But there are also radically different ways of growing food. And I haven't got time to go into that in any depth. In fact, it's probably time I stopped any second. But I think we can learn a lot from this. So these are allotments, very similar to vegetable gardens in vegetable patches in people's own gardens. But allotments are quite popular in many European countries, very popular in the UK. They might look rather messy and unproductive, but surprisingly, a good, competent allotment holder can get between 30 and 40 tons of mixed fruit and vegetables from an allotment per 30 or 40 tons per hectare per year. And if you compare that to industrial farming, say wheat, which gets about 10 tons per hectare per year, this is actually much more productive. On top of which, recent research has shown that allotments are the richest places for insect life in cities. They're better than gardens, they're better than parks, they're better than old churchyards, they are the best habitat for insects. They have more carbon in the soil. And finally, there was a recent study from the Netherlands which showed that people who own allotments are healthier than people who don't have allotments. Perhaps it's the exercise, perhaps it's the healthy fruit and veg that they're growing, perhaps it's the social side of it. They're getting out, they've got a reason to go out and talk to their neighboring allotment holders. We don't really know. But if this can produce lots of food and support biodiversity and make people healthy, then shouldn't we be doing more of this? And it's really sad. In the UK, there are 90,000 people on waiting lists for allotments. They can't get hold of land on which they would like to grow their own healthy, 0 food kilometers, no packaging, no pesticide, often, food. And they can't, which is frustrating. And I'd love to see politicians freeing up more land for people to grow food more like this. But you can sort of hybridize the two systems. Sorry, I'm rushing slightly. I think industrial monoculture farming can borrow from some of the principles which make allotmenting so productive by introducing more diversity of plants to the landscape. This is an example from France, where big fields of wheat are being divided up by rows of trees. Those rows of trees could be fruit trees, so that you're getting more than one crop from the landscape. Most free-range chickens are kept in bare, grassy fields, so the only harvest the farmer gets is eggs. But why not have fruit trees as well? I would love it if we were doing more farming like this. I love this picture. It just kind of summarizes what I think farming could, or at least some farming could look like. It's more labor-intensive to grow lots of different crops together. You can't harvest this with a combine harvester, fairly obviously. But why not get more people back on the land involved in farming and reverse this trend that's been going on for 100 years of fewer and fewer people being involved in food growing? After all, there's not a shortage of people in the world. There's more and more of us every day. And predictions suggest that many conventional jobs will cease to occupy us in the near future because they'll be replaced by artificial intelligence. So what are the 10 billion of us going to do in a few years' time? Well, maybe we should all get back to the land and start growing vegetables. Okay, so to finish off, I'll finish with the same picture I started with. This is where we live, obviously, and we're making a terrible, terrible mess of it. People would do anything, it seems to me, for their kids, apart from leaving them a decent planet to live on. And there's a real danger. I've got kids, and I wonder what kind of world they'll be living in 50 years from now. I think it's highly likely that it will have had most of its resources used up, and most of its natural beauty will have been lost. And we have to surely do better than that. And maybe we can start by looking after the insects better than we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, thank you. Not the jungle, garden jungle. It's wildlife gardening in German.
In German.
Okay, not the okay. Thank you very much. It's your applause. Are you vegetarian? Are you vegetarian?
I'm not vegetarian, but I don't eat. My children, 2 of the 3 are, and I eat very little meat, but I do like meat, so I eat a little bit. But if we eat more chicken and just try to eat less meat altogether, I think that's the way forward myself.
This is the right title of your book, and the next book will be the essence of your keynote today, huh?
Yes.
Also das nächste Buch, auf das können wir uns freuen. Es wird genau das enthalten, was er eben als Vortrag natürlich in weit umfangreicherer Form dann zusammenfassen wird.